morning. I'm going to talk about humanity's greatest challenge. You've probably spotted that's our atmosphere there, as thin as the skin is to an apple. This depressing chart shows how CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have grown at an increasing rate since the Rio Earth Summit 30 years ago, through 25 conferences since. There's Paris. Talk and promises have had little impact. One of our greatest thinkers said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Let's have a look at global plans now to eliminate fossil fuels. The IPCC told the world in 2018 that we must burn no more than 420 billion tons of carbon for a likely chance of staying within 1.5 degrees. That's our carbon budget. They said we could delay reaching net zero until 2050, but only if we made ambitious near-term cuts in emissions to stretch our carbon budget out. So let's see what actually happened. COVID cut global emissions by 7%, but instead of continuing on down with a green recovery, governments directed stimulus money at high carbon industries. And so we're already back to pre-COVID levels. If we carry on like this, we'll use up our carbon budget by 2029, putting us on a path to catastrophic global heating. There'll be ever more severe downpours and flooding, wildfires, droughts and crop failure. Rising sea levels will ultimately reclaim large parts of London and many other major cities. Floods will devastate low-lying farmland and cause unprecedented levels of damage to property. Studies say that costs will be astronomical. The cost of prevention will be high, but nevertheless far lower. Now, some impacts won't affect us directly, but the UN warns of up to 1.2 billion migrants fleeing drought, famine and war over the next 30 years. That's over 1,000 million. How could our society cope with even a fraction of this number? So we need a mobilization on the scale of World War II or COVID to face this crisis. This illustration here shows a 7% fall in emissions next year. Cutting by equal amounts would mean reaching net zero by 2036 to stay within our carbon budget. 7% is challenging. For context, UK's barely managed 1% a year since 1990, though COVID did take emissions down 11%. But remember, we're looking at the global picture here. Our climate change committee assumes that all countries will cut emissions at the same rate, but we know that's far from possible with populations and living standards still growing in continents like Africa, and much infrastructure still to be built, which causes emissions with production of concrete. That, combined with our position as the 5th largest historical emitter, means that we must cut greenhouse gases even more rapidly. Now, I just want to talk a little more about carbon budgets at this point. Key to our success is that we stop fixating on when we reach net zero. It's how much carbon we burn on the way there that matters. In this illustration, we still hit net zero by 2050, but we blow our budget out the water. So we must manage emissions meticulously, month by month, year by year, to stay on track. Now, let's have a look at the UK a little bit more closely. Newspaper headlines have claimed that we're halfway to net zero, but that's only on the very narrow measure of territorial emissions. Once we add imports, aviation and shipping, all currently excluded, though still our responsibility, the fall in our total carbon footprint is much lower. That's only 1% per year. The government isn't breaking any rules here, but the rules are decades out of date and urgently need review. Now, let's have a look at the UK's plans going forwards. This chart shows the UK's performance against its carbon budgets. Now, first of all, I want to recognise that the government's come a long way with some ambitious targets. We still need to go further, as we've just seen, but credit where credit's due. I'd like to point out two key things here. This is the net zero pathway that the government's committed to, but this is where the government's own projections show we're heading. Now, the government's under fire from many of its advisors, most notably the Public Accounts Committee, for not having a plan to deliver on its targets. From the Climate Change Committee, only 2 of 31 milestones achieved. Philip Dunn in the Environmental Audit Committee has said there's no plan or funding for housing retrofit. Yes, the government have gone further than many others in announcing ambitious targets, but there are so many major policies working in entirely the wrong direction. HS2 proceeding despite a permanent shift in business travel, permitting airports to expand despite flights needing to be cut by 12% at a minimum. The list goes on. Coal mine, wind power not happening, EVs transition too slow. Now, funding. We can't tackle a planetary scale problem like climate change with less than 1/25 of the cost of just one railway. Need more explanation. So the solution, the CEE bill, was designed by eminent scientists to address all the problems I've outlined. It's a legal framework to deliver policy and action in line with the government's own ambitions, and it's oven ready. It would set us on a 1.5-degree compatible path, which we've already signed up to aim for, as well as delivering on key biodiversity targets. It would have us include our entire footprint, including greenhouse gases emitted abroad for us, but we shouldn't be frightened of that. That will work in our favour, giving a competitive advantage to UK companies producing on our clean grid, bringing back jobs and improved security of supply, as well as reducing China's need for coal power. Passing the bill will initiate a much needed stimulus with hundreds of thousands of jobs created in areas like home retrofit and nature restoration, a fantastic way to deliver on the levelling up agenda. Rapid cleaning of our air will save up to 36,000 deaths a year. And that's not just older people dying a few months before they should, children are dying too, and it's getting worse, and that's from Public Health England. A handful of Conservative MPs are now in a unique position to turn the ship around and break the inexorable trend we saw on the first chart. Passing the CEE bill would set a gold standard for the world, and those involved will go down in history in the most positive way. Now, there are a number of objections flying around to the CEE bill. We've seen this first one just isn't true, even on the government's own figures. The Environment Bill exists to tidy up loose ends as we leave the EU. It has nothing whatsoever to do with climate or restoring nature. It doesn't even mention CO2, woodland, bees, carbon, fossil fuels, aviation. I could go on. Forest only appears in relation to logging. So a cross for that. Citizens' assemblies will actually help the government pass laws, unpopular with some, because people like them will have been part of the decision aired publicly on TV, and people will feel that their views have been represented. And crucially, Parliament will always have the final say, retaining full sovereignty. So these objections fall away. We still have time to choose our future. As this great man said, it may sound frightening, but the scientific evidence is that if we have not taken dramatic action within the next decade, we could face irreversible damage to the natural world and the collapse of our societies. It's hard to imagine a starker warning. Or we can follow the science and take bold, urgent action to stop burning fossil fuels, ushering in a new era where we may, for the first time in the entire history of humanity, come to know what it feels like to be secure. Inaction is a choice which threatens the security of our country and indeed all of our progress as a civilization. This is the most important choice any of us will ever have to make in our lifetimes, and those in positions of responsibility with clearer knowledge now than ever before of the existential dangers we're facing have the weight of history on their shoulders.